activate your mandatory. The excuse used to duck fighters. Let's talk about it.
Straighter, not a roundhouse right hand.
And that's what we've been talking about. The straight shot is the one where he gets leverage on it.
I don't want to kill
Pull
somebody
back
for
a
a
little
few
bit.
seconds.
Nah, I want a body on my record.
Now, I want to see you fight motherfuckers. I do. All right, I'm with you. I'm with you. As long as you're trying to fight the greats, the best competition.
Welcome to the graveyard. Click the link if you dare to. Bury you alive, I'm prepared to. Welcome to the graveyard. You get your sources from clowns, so when you come around, we don't hear you. Welcome to the graveyard. Click the link if you dare to. Bury you alive, I'm prepared to. Welcome to the graveyard. You get your sources from clowns, so when you come around, we don't hear you. Yo, it's the best, fight the best. If you ain't with the moto, just click the link, bitch, and get buried like the rest. It ain't gonna work how you want it. These trolls already tried, too many come but don't leave. So if you here, you gotta die. I'm spitting straight facts. These bitches crying cause they hate that. The LDBC's the top topic, bitch, take that. We the ones that bring the truth to these fans. So while you hate, I'ma laugh and keep counting these bands. Welcome to the graveyard. Click the link, get the dance. Bury you alive, I'm prepared to. Welcome to the graveyard. You get your sources from clowns, so when you come around, we don't hear you. Welcome to the graveyard. Click the link if you dare to. Bury you alive, I'm prepared to. Welcome to the graveyard. You get your sources from clowns, so when you come around, we don't hear you.
Welcome to the graveyard.
A fighter who is ranked number 1 needs to somehow activate their mandatory. So the excuse that Crawford fans used in order for Terrence Crawford to duck Shawn Porter was that Shawn Porter needed to activate his mandatory. That was the excuse used. We're going to have a problem with that. We definitely have a problem. Because, number 1, in order for you to be a mandatory, the sanctioning body must call you as the mandatory. The sanctioning body must officially designate you as the mandatory. The WBO never officially designated Shawn Porter at all. He was never officially designated as the mandatory, because if he ever was officially designated as the mandatory, then you can go to a thing called purse bid. You can go to a purse bid. Shawn Porter was never called as the mandatory to Terrence Crawford. Being that he was never called as the mandatory to Terrence Crawford, there was room, a gap, a space open for negotiations in order to make the fight. If he was called as the mandatory, there is no negotiations. It is, you are the mandatory. You need to fight him by X date. If by X date, this is not signed, sealed, and delivered, it goes to purse bid. If it goes to purse bid, whoever wins the purse bid, the champion gets 60% and the challenger gets 40 or 75-25 or 65-35, whatever the fuck it is. The champion gets a bigger split and the challenger gets a less split. If it goes to purse bid, whoever wins the purse dictates the terms. It never went to purse bid because Shawn Porter was never called as the mandatory. Oh, he needs to activate it. Well, if Shawn Porter needs to activate his mandatory, then why were you sane people that's saying this? Why were y'all not telling Dillian White to activate his WBC mandatory? Why couldn't Dillian White just flip the switch and say, okay, I'm the mandatory now. The WBC, doesn't matter if they sanction it or not. I'm the mandatory, you need to fight me. We are going to purse bid Deontay Wilder if you don't fight me. We're going to purse bid. How come that didn't happen? 600 days, number 1, baby. See, y'all don't want to talk about that, though. So it's different when it comes to Bud, though, right? Bud he don't got no blame, none. Bud holds no blame. But Deontay Wilder holds all the blame for not fighting Dillian White. The champion holds all the blame for not fighting a challenger, not the challenger, a challenger, the champion, when it comes to Deontay Wilder. and Dillian White, the number one. But when it comes to Terrence Crawford, the champion, and number one, Shawn Porter, it's Shawn Porter's fault for not activating his mandatory. You do not activate a mandatory. The WBO, the WBA, the WBC, the IBF, they activate a mandatory. Oh, but BFTB, he could have called and petitioned. He could have called the W. He was number one. He could have called. Okay, cool. Deontay Wilder is number one in the WBC. He's number one to Tyson Fury. Why wasn't he the mandatory? Oh, that's different though. Oh, that was different. It's different, BFTB. That's different because there was a contract talks between Fury and AJ. So that okay, cool. So Canelo Alvarez is the 168-pound WBC champion. David Benavidez is the number one contender. Are you telling me that David Benavidez is ducking Canelo Alvarez? Because David Benavidez, as the number one, isn't flipping the switch to mandate himself? Is that what you're telling me? So David Benavidez is scared of Canelo Alvarez. David Benavidez doesn't want to fight Canelo Alvarez. Is that what you're telling me? Because David Benavidez is number one in the WBC. I'm just asking the question. So are y'all telling me that? Are y'all telling me David Benavidez is scared of Canelo? All he got to do to get a Canelo fight is activate his mandatory. That's all he's got to do. Is that what you're telling me? Of course you're not. No, you're not telling me that. Oh, this is Canelo Alvarez. This is different. Oh, it's different. It's different. So a number one, and Shawn Porter needs to activate his mandatory. But number one, David Benavidez don't need to do nothing. So we're going to shit on Canelo Alvarez. We're going to say Canelo is ducking David Benavidez. Canelo's ducking David Benavidez. Tyson Fury don't want no smoke with Deontay Wilder. But Shawn Porter, the challenger, ducked the champion. Well, what about Jaime Munguia? How come you guys are not pressuring Jaime Munguia, who is the number one in the WBO, to fight Demetrius Andrade? How come Jaime Munguia is not the mandatory? Wait a minute. How come Jaime Munguia is not pressing to fight Jermall Charlo? He's number one there too. So let me guess. Jaime Munguia can fight either Demetrius Andrade or Jermall Charlo whenever he wants. All he got to do is flip the switch. We're just waiting on him? Is that what we're saying? Okay. All right. Well, what about Shawn Porter fighting Errol Spence in a rematch? He's number one in the WBC. Let me guess. Shawn Porter don't want to fight Errol Spence in a rematch. Shawn Porter, he's waiting. He's negotiating. He's negotiating with Errol Spence for the rematch because Shawn Porter is number one in the WBC. Number one. So, we don't gotta wait. He ain't gotta wait for the WBC. He ain't gotta wait for nothing. All he's gotta do is activate himself as a WBC mandatory, and poof, there you go. Is that what we're saying? I'm just asking. These are just questions. They're just questions. What about Chris Eubank? Chris Eubank is number one to a Ryota Murata. Oh, they're unifying, BFTB. Murata and Golovkin are unifying, so that takes precedence. Unifications over mandatories. Okay, cool, no problem. No problem at all. No problem at all. So Virgil Ortiz is number one in the WBO. So let me guess, Virgil Ortiz is scared and ducking Terrence Crawford, and all he's got to do is activate his mandatory? Virgil Ortiz was in the ring saying, I want to fight you. He is number one. Are you telling me that all he's got to do to get a fight with Terrence Crawford, the great Terrence Crawford, all he's got to do is go to the WBO and tell them to activate his mandatory? Just a question, bro. These are just questions. Just questions. Vasyl Lomachenko is number one in the WBC. Number one. Why isn't Vasyl Lomachenko activating his mandatory to get a rematch with Teofimo Lopez? Or to fight Devin Haney? Why isn't he activating his mandatory? Rolly, Fruit Roll-Up, is number one in the WBA. Why isn't he activating his mandatory to fight Teofimo Lopez? I'm just asking, bro. I'm just asking. These are just questions. They're just questions. Don't get mad at me. They're just questions. Why isn't Rolly Romero activating his mandatory to fight Teofimo Lopez? Why isn't Chris Colbert activating his mandatory to fight Tank Davis? He's number 1 in the WBA. He's number 1. Oh, let me guess. It's only Sean Porter that has the ability to activate a mandatory. No other fighter can do it. It's just Sean Porter. And he can only do it in the WBO. He can't do it in WBC, the WBA, the IBF. Nobody can do it anywhere else. It is just Sean Porter that has the ability to activate his mandatory. And it's only with the WBO. Because he's number 1 in WBC, and he can't activate that. But he can activate his mandatory when it comes to the WBO. Nowhere else he can activate it. You motherfuckers expect me to believe that all these guys who are number 1 to a champion, some of them in rematches, all they got to do is activate their mandatory, and they can get the money fight with the champion right away. That's what you guys expect me to believe. That's what y'all expect boxing fans to believe. Y'all motherfuckers are pathetic, bro. Y'all do any and everything to dick ride Bud Crawford to keep this man from fighting anybody. Oh, well, Sean Porter ducked. The nigga said he'll be ready by May. That's what he said. You guys were supposed to be fighting Manny Pacquiao, and you turned it down. So if you're supposed to be fighting Manny Pacquiao and you turn it down, and Terrence Crawford said, oh, well, you stand by because now you trying me. So if what I got falls through, then pretty much you next. You refused to sign to Manny Pacquiao. So why isn't Sean Porter next? Because you ducked him. That's why. You do not activate your fucking mandatories. The sanctioning bodies call you as a mandatory. And when they call you as a mandatory, then is when the purse bids come into play and all that other shit. Until they call you, it is on the champion to fight as number 1. If the champion doesn't want to fight as number 1, then he just doesn't fight as number 1. If the sanctioning bodies call him or her as the number 1, as the number 1 they are, and they call them as the mandatory, that's when the ball starts rolling. Green Beans did not petition to be the mandatory. He was called for it. He fought Ray Robinson in a fight to determine the mandatory. Period. So miss me with that activate your fucking mandatory excuse to duck somebody. BFTB. Shout out to the LDBC. And I'm out.